Okay, so excellent. So during Black History Month, the fight for voting rights in our democracy proceeds on 4 fronts as we continue the work of Reconstruction and the civil rights movement on the road to a more perfect union. The 4 fronts: accountability for the Capitol insurrection, voting rights legislation, legal challenges to voter suppression laws, and get out the vote. As progressives, we are aware that there's an ongoing legal effort to fight Republican voter suppression measures in the states. And this is actually led by Mark Elias, who's a Democratic lawyer, and his website, Democracy Docket, provides a summary of those efforts in 2020 up to the present. And his website states, quote, "American democracy is at stake, and it depends on each one of us to defend it. The best way to fight against voter suppression, stay informed," end of quote. Democracy Docket is the leading progressive media platform dedicated to providing information, opinion, and analysis about voting rights, elections, and democracy. It gives an idea of the kind of devices Republicans are using to suppress African American, Latino, and urban voters. Daniel.
In dramatic terms, President Biden noted the historic urgency of enacting new federal voting rights legislation in his commemoration speech on December 17th of last year. He went to South Carolina and he said, "I've spoken to over 140 heads of state since I've become president. You know what they all ask me? Is America going to be all right? What about democracy in America?" Did you ever think you'd be asked that question by another leader? And he said he was not exaggerating. And this is addressing Congressman Clyburn from South Carolina. Biden said, one of the things I thought, and Jim probably didn't, but President Biden thought, was that when we had some of the major victories, we finally crossed a threshold. What I didn't realize is you can defeat hate, but you can't eliminate it. It just slides back under a rock. And when given oxygen by political leaders, it comes out ugly and mean as it was before. And now, the new federal voting rights legislation that's ongoing litigation and a robust get out the vote effort are all essential to protect democracy in 2022. We know that new federal voting rights legislation was unsuccessful. However, in this event, we want to look at how we can focus on our voting rights, look at the history of voting rights, and propose actions to keep the momentum for fairness in voting going.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Okay, so to start off our event, we'll show you a 12-minute video called "Represent Us" with Jennifer Lawrence.
Witnessing a total political system failure in America. If you're anything like me, you may find yourself constantly overwhelmed by everything that's wrong with politics. And when I say politics, I'm not talking about Democrats or Republicans. I'm talking about the flaws that exist in our political system, regardless of which party is in power. And I know it's hard to talk about politics these days, but look, the government is ours. We pay for it, so it needs to work for us. And right now it doesn't, and I mean it really doesn't. So what's going on here? Is it Russian meddling in social media? Is it him? Is it her? No. Those two were the least popular presidential candidates since they began keeping track of such things. Only 4% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in Congress now. Just 4%. America is no longer even considered a full democracy. We are witnessing a total political system failure in America, which is the complete opposite of what our nation's founders had in mind. So I'm going to show you 3 lines that show what's causing this failure, how we can fix it, and what you can do about it. So here's your first line. What I want you to do is take any issue you really care about and picture it on this line. This line comes from a Princeton University study that shows how public opinion influences the laws that Congress does or doesn't pass. They looked at 1,800 public opinion polls over a 20-year period, and we took their data and plotted it in this chart. See this horizontal line? That shows public support for a law amongst average Americans. This vertical line, that shows the likelihood of the public support leading to the passage of a law. When you plot it for the average American, you get a line that looks like this. There's your issue sitting on that line. If there is zero support for a law, there's about a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. And if there is 100% support for something, the most popular thing ever, there's still a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. So the line is horizontal because no matter how much support there is among average Americans, there's still a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass that law. Princeton determined that the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. How in the hell does that happen? Consider this. Politicians are spending up to 70% of their time raising funds for re-election after they get into office. Why? Because in order to win a seat in the Senate in some races, you would have to raise $45,000 every single day. 365 days a year for 6 years to raise enough money to win. Now consider that only 0.05% of Americans give more than $10,000 to politics. And then you see why politicians have become completely dependent on the 0.05% of Americans, billionaires and special interest groups, who fund their campaigns. Meanwhile, you've got lobbyists writing our laws and donating to the politicians who pass them. We have a two-party duopoly of Democrats and Republicans that makes it so that independents can't win, while the American people are leaving the major parties in droves. As you can see here, nearly half of American voters are now registered independent. And then there's gerrymandering, with politicians drawing the boundaries of their own voting districts into crazy shapes designed to prevent competition. Today, only 14% of House campaigns are actually competitive. 86% of them are not. And we wonder why young people feel that their vote doesn't matter. I've covered a lot here, but it all adds up to this vast ring of influence over our elected leaders. It's a corrupt system in which we, the people, have near zero influence over our own government. And that is sad. That is not the country I feel like I grew up in. But what's worse is that by allowing this to happen, we are causing the failure of the most important issues facing our nation. We're wasting trillions of dollars a year on fraud and abuse in our own government. 1 in 5 American children live in poverty. Our healthcare is the most expensive in the world. We have more people in prison per capita than Russia and China. We're losing jobs to the rest of the world, and we're not even doing enough to keep our air and our water clean for our children. America was founded on the promise of self-governance, but instead we have statistically non-significant impact on public policy. So the question is, how do we unrig this system? I'm obsessed with this idea, not just of unrigging it, but actually fixing it. That's when I met Josh.
This is it. This is the issue behind the issues. If we fix the system, we'll have so much more power to fix everything else. So I spoke to some of the most brilliant people in the country. Constitutional scholar Lawrence Lessig, Zephyr Teachout, and dozens of other constitutional scholars and experts and strategists. They all said the same thing. You could pass a law that would stop political bribery and fix our broken elections. And if you could do that, you could wrest power away from the corrupt establishment and put it back in the hands of the people. Here's how you fix our broken elections. End gerrymandering with independent redistricting commissions.
Create ranked choice voting so third parties and independents can run and win.
Implement automatic voter registration and vote from home.
And here's how we can crack down on political bribery. Overhaul lobbying and ethics laws and close the revolving door so politicians can't be bribed with high-paying job offers.
Mandate full transparency of political spending so we know who's trying to buy influence.
Give every voter a $50 or $100 tax voucher so politicians spend time fundraising from their constituents, not just that 0.05% that I talked about earlier.
If you could pass even just some of these reforms, you would undo that ring of influence and begin to reinstate we the people as the most important influence over our elected leaders. So we took all of these reforms and put them in a model law and named it the Anti-Corruption Act. And get this, 87% of Americans support making the Anti-Corruption Act the law of the land. Look at the breakdown. 91% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans. It's incredible. Now you might be thinking 9 out of 10 Americans. Surely Congress will pass it. But on this issue, more than any other issue, it's like asking the fox to put a lock on the henhouse. Politicians won in the current system, and they have an incentive not to fix it. So we need to go around Congress, in this case, by passing anti-corruption acts in cities and states all across America. Now, every time I say this, people look at me and say, how does passing city and state laws lead to fixing all of these problems with the federal government?
Can I do this part?
Go for it.
So first of all, the US Constitution gives states sole control over how elections are run, even federal elections. So when we fix gerrymandering or election laws, that fixes the federal election in each state. That means that by going state by state, we have an immediate impact on how we elect Congress and how we hold them accountable. But there's more, and that brings us to our second line. This line is from a Bloomberg News study. It finds that throughout American history, passing state laws leads to federal victory. Let me show you what I mean. This chart shows the number of states over time that pass laws giving women the right to vote. When it hits the right side of the chart, that's the federal victory. Okay, now I want you to watch the blue line. We're gonna do this again with interracial marriage. There were a few states in the Northeast that made it legal decades ago, and centuries go by, and we hit this blue line where all of a sudden there's a rush of activity, which leads pretty quickly to federal passage. So here we are again with same-sex marriage. One state, Massachusetts, for many years. A couple decades later, we hit that blue line, a jump in state activity and federal passage. This isn't about these issues. This is about a winning political strategy. The crucial finding in the Bloomberg study is that a key event, often a court decision or a grassroots campaign reaching maturity, triggers a rush of state activity that ultimately leads to a change in federal law. So fixing this problem is possible, but how do we create our trigger moment for this issue? Well, the grassroots campaign from the study, that's Represent Us. We're bringing conservatives and progressives together to pass anti-corruption laws all across America using 3 strategic innovations: right-left coalitions, calling out corruption, and building a movement, a big movement. And I'm gonna break them down for you.
Can I do this part?
No. First, right-left. This is how people self-identify in America. This isn't party identification. This is how you feel politically. And as you can see, it's 25% liberal, 36% conservative, and 34% moderate. But for the past 40 years on the reforms I've outlined, it's liberals speaking to liberals using liberal language with liberal messengers, liberal. I just had to say that one more time. And you're just not gonna change the political power structure of America with 25% of the people. Fixing corruption requires that we enlist all Americans, liberal, conservatives, and moderates who, as we've shown, overwhelmingly support reform. Number 2, corruption. When we talk about money in politics, gerrymandering, democracy, campaign finance reform, most people just tune out, but people are fired up about corruption. And number 3, we must build a movement, a big movement comprised of all kinds of people from all across America fighting to pass anti-corruption laws, and then make sure they are implemented and protected. So again, liberals and conservatives working together, corruption, and build a movement. This is the foundation of Represent Us. We believe the government should work for every American, not just a handful of billionaires and special interests. But it's not just an idea. In a few years, we've already racked up 85 wins all across the country. And if we can get those 85 wins to 850 wins, we can fix our corrupt political system, save America, and get to work on fixing everything else that's broken in our country. This is how we build this movement big enough to trigger that rush of state activity that leads to a change in federal law. And that brings us to our last line. Right now, this is you. And right now, these are all of the ways that you can help us go state by state, city by city, to fix the corruption in American politics. Volunteer and join a Represent Us chapter. Or, if that's not your thing, join the Commonwealth to make a monthly donation in support of someone who does volunteer. 100% of your money goes straight to passing these laws, not to overhead or our expenses. Every voice matters. Your voice matters. If you do nothing, nothing changes. But if we all do a little, we can win together. So the only question left is this. Will you cross that line? Join us at represent.us.
All right, everybody. Bruce Murray here. Oh. I hate it when that happens. Bruce Murray here. We have another video coming up, and it was a bit impatient and wanted to get started right away, but no. We heard that it's We the People, and we're going to take a few minutes here to ask you to respond. If you have reactions, if you do, go to the chat box and enter your name, star hand up, unmute when we call on you, and we'll take your comment. And if anybody would like to just raise a hand and say, I'm ready to go, that is an option too. All right.
Carl has a hand up.
Go for it, Carl.
That just made me feel a lot better, because that's the whole thing. I'm like, what are we doing? We got to do something, and we just can't say something. We got to do something. So we have to challenge that. The only way we can do that is to come out with these policies. So that's the answer. That's really that. I'm telling you, I felt so much better. You got to give me that video. I got to show it to my people, because we're so frustrated, and we're like knocking our heads and figuring out what we want to do, and we know we're going to get more people to vote and all these other things, but we have to fight them from taking our voting rights. And so we have to do it by the policy. So wonderful. I'm going to sign up. And so what was that website again? So www.represent us.
That's it. And what's great is that you can join a local chapter too and contribute to taking it from 85 local victories on up to that point where it tips. And just as was the case with the other policies Jennifer Lawrence outlined, then it just caves in and we win with that focus on anti-corruption. Cliff, I think you're the next in the queue.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed watching the video. I'm a little bit nervous about how long I think it would take to do the second line approach that she described, meaning passing federal law through a wave of state laws. Can we afford that time? It seems like it's more urgent than we can afford to go that route, even if that's proven to be effective. Thanks.
I was looking at that line for the second and third issues that Jennifer Lawrence highlighted, and it was 50 states, and it looked as though it didn't get to the majority of states before it tipped. It seemed like it started tipping at about 15 to 20 states. And now we're talking about municipalities, but that is happening on a variety of issues. I certainly share Cliff's sentiment that time is of the essence. I guess that means that we have to feel Carl's enthusiasm and go ahead and jump in with Represent Us and see if we can contribute in some way. I think the next person in the queue was Sue, and then we'll go to David. And then
No, go to David.
David and then Sue.
I thought it was a great presentation and very persuasive. Sounds really valid. And I just want to say, I think there's many different ways to approach this problem. I don't think there's any one like magic answer or silver bullet. And I don't think we should like jump on one particular program, but we need to do different things pretty much at the same time. And just pragmatically, probably each one of us pick what it is we're going to work on. And later in this meeting, I'm going to talk about some other things that might address what Cliff just brought up about absolute immediate, I mean like today and this week, things that we can do that are going to matter on the ground right now. And I'm not saying that's more important than the long term that was in that video that we just saw. They're both important, and other things are important as well.
Thank you
So,
very much, David. And
yeah.
I'll take it over to Sue for just a short comment, and then it's on to Betsy as we begin summarizing the other resources we presented in preparation for the meeting. Go ahead, Sue.
David said what I was thinking, so I don't really have anything more to add. Thanks.
All right, then Betsy, we're going to turn it over to you to summarize the book we had recommended as a resource for preparing for the meeting today.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so the book was One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy by Carol Anderson, and it was published in 2018. And you may remember she also wrote the book called White Rage. Okay, so One Person, No Vote, as I say, is a sequel to White Rage, offering a history of policies that have systematically impeded African-American progress since 1865. And in the book, she chronicles the rollbacks to African-American participation in the vote since the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, that really eviscerated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And she skillfully documents how Republican-led state governments exploit a weakened Voters' Right Act to tilt elections in their favor. Voter suppression targeting Black citizens and other people of color dates to Reconstruction. And I think one thing I just want to put in here, it's been a continual process. It hasn't been stops and starts, it's been continual. And this comes out very much in the book. The Mississippi Plan of 1890 and similar laws across the South instituted literary tests and poll taxes to lock out disadvantaged African Americans. State officials encouraged violence against would-be voters. Black activists turned to the courts to overthrow these laws, and the 1960 civil rights protests in Selma, Alabama led to the Voting Rights Act, which forced regions with a history of discrimination to submit election-related laws for federal preclearance. VRA suffered setbacks from weak oversight by Republican administrations, dog whistle complaints about state rights, and an assumption that its success proved that it wasn't needed anymore. And she follows really what I saw as the astonishing story of government-dictated racial discrimination, which was unfolding before our eyes and still is as more and more states adopt voter suppression laws. Shelby County versus Holder gutted the VRA provisions for enforcing preclearance. In other words, it didn't have to go through the Department of Justice. Districts with a demonstrated history of racial discrimination were able to change voting requirements without the approval of the Department of Justice. Anderson details several forms of voter suppression, from photo ID requirements and what's called interstate cross-checks, going state to state, looking at whether people are on the rolls, to gerrymandering, to poll closures. After the 2000 election, Republicans elevated election security and fraud into national issues, despite few cases of malicious intent, and continuously they do that, this idea of fraud. States passed voter identification laws that go beyond federal recommendations and are often discriminatory, such as refusing to accept government-issued assisted housing IDs, Department of Motor Vehicle and licensing officers closures in urban neighborhoods force voters to drive far and lose time off of work to get an accepted ID. And efforts to overturn these laws in the courts are met with regurgitated talking points about voter fraud. And in the end, she has a little part there in the end, explores the resistance to all of this, the organizing, activism, and court battles to restore the basic right to vote to all Americans. And we're going to bring that issue up a little bit later in this event. Thanks very much for your attention. And this is the actual vote, cover of the vote. It's really good. It's a very, very good book. I could hardly put it down when I read it, so I recommend it to you all. Okay.
All right, Sue, you're next with a summary of our first article.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, the article is looking back at voting rights legislation in 2021. It's on Democracy Docket. It was shared in the event posting and the RSVP emails. So my takeaways from the article were first, that many people are actively fighting for democracy every day in the courts. There's dozens of court cases happening. And there's a huge pressure right now to fight GOP-led voter suppression laws, as well as the partisan gerrymandering that's happening. And on the positive side, there are some wins. There are some wins that are happening. Another takeaway for me is just that like gerrymandering, the process for redistricting and voting laws are kind of effed up in the USA, like that we go through this every 10 years, that with the redistricting, that there have to be court battles in so many states. Just since January 1st, there were 23 suits filed. Just since January 1st of this year, 23 suits filed in a whole bunch of different states. Some of them GOP aligned, some of them Dem aligned, some of them are somewhere in between, like the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, is suing New York State because they have a ban on serving food or drink that costs more than $1 to people in voting lines. And the DCCC is suing over the state's practices that lead to high rejection rates of absentee ballots. It's the NAACP that's suing New York for their ban on providing food and water to voting lines. So there's a 1976 law that says you can't spend more than $1 per person, which obviously doesn't allow you to give people much nowadays. But there are wins happening. The threat is real. And actions that we can take, sort of related to the redistricting and court battles over voter suppression. First, we can fight voter suppression laws before they're enacted, so we can be, try to be ahead of the game and do what we can. I know NDA. We are mobilized to do that, and there's other ways to find out about opportunities to fight these voter suppression laws. And it is also possible to attend court cases, so we could encourage our contacts back home to attend court cases, and we can find those on the Democracy Docket cases page. I can throw a link in the chat, and you can also subscribe to Democracy Docket for alerts, and they'll share information there about what's happening with voter suppression and redistricting court cases. That's what I have to say about that article. We'll have we're going to update on a couple other things, then we'll have a bigger discussion in a minute. So I think Bruce, you had another article to talk about, right?
You're darn right I do. My article comes from The Nation, and its title is How Progressives Can Mobilize to Win This and Many Fights. In their article for The Nation, Demario Cooper and Analilia Maya offer us a vision for strengthening our democracy in 2022 and beyond. These are my takeaways. We began 2021 with great expectations and an abundance of energy to push for transformational change. 1 year later, many of us stand sobered by the realities of slim House and Senate majorities. As we gear up for the midterms, some urge us to move to the center. We agree, urging all to move to the center of popular democracy and its majority positions on issues ranging from prohibiting dark money in politics to expanding Medicare, providing meaningful student debt relief, initiating a serious discussion on climate change and on reparative justice and ensuring the freedom to vote. Whether engaging in our proDA pivotal primaries project, monthly Mondays for your Progressive Minds events, or in our Progress for Progressives monthly members meetings, we progressive Democrats abroad continue to advocate for big and bold, once in a generation legislation on the scale of the crises we confront. Like so many of our fellow citizens, we assert that our work on these goals establishes the best possible foundation for electoral success in the 2022 midterms and beyond. All right, that was my speech paraphrasing the article that I read. And now we're going to take 10 minutes to react to the book, the two articles, with any comments, suggestions, questions that you might have. And Betsy is going to moderate the discussion.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm looking over in the chat box. Don't have a hand up yet. I just want to say about that book again, pushing that book, it's really good. I think the big thing for me was that about this whole idea of election fraud. And she kept going on and saying that, you know, this is such a great excuse for the Republicans, but that it doesn't exist. And this has gone on for years, you know, especially since the 2000 election. That was a really, I think, important point for all of us to remember if we think about the recent presidential election. And I just think it's a really good book because it gives a history of voter suppression. And I think that that's something that also, as I said, has been a constant.
I see Evelyn mentioned something in the chat. Might you like to unmute and make your point for all of us?
Yes and no, I'm multitasking here. So yeah, I just think that this discussion of food and water, is as terrible as that kind of sounds, is not as important as giving legislatures, at least in Georgia, the right to overturn elections. They are also in Georgia firing Democratic election officials and things like that. So I think that SB 202, at least in Georgia, contains much more serious things than passing out food and water. I mean, there are ways around that. Food and water, people can bring their own water, or you can set up a stand further away from the polling station or whatever. So because when SB 202 was passed, I got really mad at people concentrating on this food and water issue. And I'm like, hey guys, they can overturn the election. The Georgia legislature is GOP led, so you know, very biased, and changing election officials is also it's just horrifying. So lots of other things to look at there that really threaten democracy in a big way. So yeah, that's my comment on that. Thank you.
Wow, it's great to have a Georgia
Thanks
State
very
trooper
much.
on this call.
Okay, we have Arnie. You had a question.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think,
Oh,
yes.
good. Okay. yeah, Biden has been president for a year, and he's done nothing. He certainly has the power to do a lot of things without the legislature, and he's not willing to do anything. And a lot of the things that we're complaining about are policies which he had at the beginning of his thing. I think if we could move on to the vice president, maybe she could do enough to show that there's really things that can be done. Even education debt hasn't been moved, and that's an easy one, the easiest one probably. So I'm for the vice president.
Thanks very much, Arnie. Okay, Bridget, and then Meredith will be last. Bridget?
Hi, sorry, I'm not going to turn my camera on. Voting in New Jersey. Arnie, I need to respond to that because I do get very frustrated when people say that Biden's not done anything, because he's been blocked by so many people in Congress.
No.
And in addition, there's so many things coming up in the world. You know, this thing with Ukraine came up and he was just like, another thing? Are you kidding me? Because it's just like he keeps making a step forward and then another thing comes on the plate that nobody expected. So how's he supposed to keep moving? So that's very frustrating for me because I can see all of these moving parts, but I also see that through Reagan onwards that the federal government has decreased in size. And that's why the states have so much power now. And if we can increase the federal government to start regulating more things, then we'd be in a much better place. And job creation, so we can get that done. And then the other thing that's been really frustrating me lately is the talking points. It's the liberal language. And we have to change the way we speak in order for other people to hear us. So we've got, Abbott in Texas who's talking about, how if kids are in foster care or whatever, and if they're being allowed to transition, that he's going to consider it abuse. Okay, well then what's your stand on rape and incest and other abuse that's happening in that system? Let's talk about that. And why are we not pivoting back to that? We're talking about CRT and education. Why are we not talking about textbooks or what else is happening in education? There's so many other points that we can bring up that can actually change the conversation and stop their talking points. Right now, they're leading us by the nose. And by they, I mean GOP. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Bridget.
Been helpful.
Meredith, you wanted to ask a question or say something?
I don't want to, yeah, it's not a question. I want to make a comment. First of all, I have to say, I find it so disappointing that we're such a small group here. Where is everybody? We're 22 people here. We're preaching to the choir. Is this effective? It was an interesting film we saw. Maybe that should be something that is proposed for everyone to see within Democrats Abroad, to the executive committee for, the next meeting of the international group online. I've been in DA for probably, I think it's over 20 years, and I organized 2 speaking tours for a really wonderful guy named Stephen Hill. Maybe there's some people on this call who actually heard him. He toured Europe and spoke. He's a political scientist talking about changes we need to make in our voting system. And one of them is ranked voting, which now, thanks to Stephen, is going on in San Francisco, and they've started it in New York too. But even in recent history, I'm thinking we had the John Lewis voting rights event recently in the past few years. We had Capturing the Flag, which was about voter suppression and how that works in, I think it was South Carolina. But I feel just wheel spinning here, that we aren't making any progress. And all I can offer on a positive note is I did see that something like only 8% of Americans abroad vote. And it seems to me that as Democrats abroad, you know, if we want to focus on some issue where we might really have a result that can help, it shows, I think we see that Democrats abroad can be the deciding margin in some races, then maybe our best effort, rather than to try to change state laws when we're a diaspora all around the world, is instead to focus on the fact that we're Americans abroad and try make better efforts to get our fellow Americans to vote. And as far as I can tell, over 20 years of DA, one of the big sticking points is Americans who haven't never filed their taxes and realized that wasn't right. They haven't done the paperwork, even if they didn't know anything. So they don't want to raise their head above the parapet. As I understand it, that isn't going to get you in trouble with the IRS. I don't know for sure about that. But anyway, my point is, I think personally, it just makes more sense to me that as Democrats abroad, we focus on getting other Democrats abroad and other Americans abroad to vote.
Okay, thanks very much, Meredith, sorry.
Meredith.
Sue, did you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I hope we can keep the discussion going if there's other folks who want to talk. There's like so many things going through my head. I mean, I guess for Arnie and Bridget's comments, I guess, yes, there have been some things accomplished. There have been some good, there's some good legislation, you know, that Biden has managed to get through. But you know, but I respect Arnie's perspective, and I feel like you know, there must have been a way to put more of the things that America needs into packages that would force our party representatives in the Senate to vote together to package things so that we didn't have this this break off opportunity. And you know, just that's very frustrating to me. And I've been reading some articles comparing, you know, Biden and LBJ and how, you know, what it takes to get to get things passed. So I think it's fair enough for people to be frustrated, and at the same time, we need to be vocal about what has been accomplished so that we don't hand the next election over. So I think that's important. And Meredith, that's so true, that getting out the vote and finding more Americans is very, very important. And I guess for me, I feel like DA remains focused very strongly on that. There's lots of work happening around that, and all of us, you know, can participate in that and contribute to that. But, you know, from what we saw in the first video, like, you know, people's interest in voting is declining, and we're not going to always have you know, a boogie monster like Trump to motivate people to go out and vote. It's pretty easy to feel like, what difference does it make? You look at climate, what difference does it make, right? Like, one is better than the other, but the better option isn't going to solve the problem the way it is now with the platform that we have now. So I don't know if that helps or hurts my comment, but that's what I wanted to say.
Right. Well, Bruce just reminded me that we have another 15-minute discussion a little bit later on. So I'm going to move on now to screen the video by a chap called Keith Hughes. And the video is Voting Rights Legislation from Reconstruction to Shelby versus Holder and the Gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, Bruce.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Hughes History. We're hitting you up with the 1965 VRA. That's the Voting Rights Act, a monumental piece of legislation in American history that if you're in a U.S. history course, you better know about. And if you're just walking around, you should know about it anyway. So giddy up for the learning, guys. Let's go get her done right now. So before we get into the nitty gritty of the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, which is going to fundamentally change the relationship in federalism in terms of how the federal government is going to have oversight into elections to protect minorities. But of course, this all starts with the 15th Amendment. We'll read the words for you really quick.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
So those are the words, and Congress is going to take immediate action. In the 1870s, they passed what's called the Enforcement Acts, giving themselves that right to make sure that there's going to be federal oversight to make sure that African Americans vote. And it worked for a little while. They did for a little while. And then around 1875, the Supreme Court came out and they said, no, you don't have the right to do that. The Enforcement Acts are unconstitutional, really kind of ripping the teeth out of Congress's ability to enforce the 15th Amendment. So immediately after that, we're going to get basically from 1888 to 1908, every southern state passing Jim Crow laws. These Jim Crow laws are specifically denied to make sure that black people aren't going to vote. You have things like the literacy test, you have property requirements, you have poll taxes where you have to come up with money to vote. And then they even had something called the grandfather clause, where if you could show that your grandfather voted, you could be exempted from the other restrictions. What are you talking about? I'm talking about what was going on in the South. And this basically means that African Americans are totally wrote out of the political system. And of course, it's going to stay like this until the civil rights movement to the 1950s. That's another video, civil disobedience and the sit-ins and the core rides, all that stuff is all groovy and great. But what that's eventually going to do is get the federal government to take action. There's a couple theses I'll share with you. One of them is kind of like the government's kind of like, standing on the people are fire. And the government, even if it really wants to do something, they're kind of slow to do things. But if you get enough people to light fires, eventually it's going to reach the feet of the federal government. They're going to have to put their hands down to do something. And that happens with the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. Of course, the Eisenhower administration is Republican. We have to remember that this is a different political landscape back then. Mainly Democrats in the South, Southern Democrats, oppose civil rights. They're standing on the principles of states' rights. They want segregation for the most part. They're against all of this. So it's really a coalition of Republicans and Northern Democrats that are going to make all of this groovy stuff happen. And it happens twice, 1957 Civil Rights Act and the 1960 Civil Rights Act. Both of them are going to move the ball in the sense of at least giving the Attorney General the ability to sue these states if they're violating the 15th Amendment. So there's going to be a liability issue, and they're going to push it through the courts, which is kind of like pushing a stone through a straw. It doesn't work really well. So we're going to keep getting civil rights action and civil rights movement, culminating with the I Have a Dream speech in 1963 in August in Washington, D.C. I have a dream that we're going to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is going to not affect voting that much, but not that much. It's really dealing with discrimination in public accommodations like restaurants and hotels and all that kind of jazz. But immediately after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Johnson is kind of talking to his advisors about going after voting rights. And a lot of his advisors are telling him, now's not the time, all right? If we lose Southern Democrats, if they're so mad at you that they don't support your Great Society programs, Medicaid, Medicare, and all this jazz, then you're going to go down the tubes, brother. So Johnson kind of backs away from it a little bit, and then things on the ground start changing, namely interest groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Council with Martin Luther King and SNCC, the SNCC, more of a northern turning militant group almost at this point. And even guys like Malcolm X are going to go down south to try to get voters to register. It's in Selma where these forces clash with the sheriff, Jim Clark, very famous footage, basically not letting these guys register to vote. It ain't going to happen. I don't care who says what. Martin Luther King shows up, gets arrested. This is where he writes his famous letter from a Selma jail, which is published in the New York Times, which kind of goes to another thesis idea that if you spread the message, it's kind of like stink don't stink until it's in your backyard. And when people see the sheriff beating these people down, they see Martin Luther King getting arrested, they read his words about voting rights in the New York Times, stink don't stink until it's in the New York Times. There's more pressure now on the Johnson administration, and they say, okay, we're we're going to start moving on this. And then Jimmy Lee Jackson gets killed in Selma in a skirmish, kind of protecting his mother. A cop shot him. And that really is what's going to push these groups over the edge, which are going to march from Selma to Birmingham to make sure they're going to register voters. This is where we have that famous conflict on the bridge where the protesters are tear gassed. This is Bloody Sunday. You can see some of the horrible footage right behind me right there. And this is going to be kind of it for Johnson. Johnson's going to go on TV. He's going to address the nation and basically say that now is the time. We need a Voting Rights Act to protect these people. And within 2 days, Congress has the bill written. So let's take a look at the bill, and then we'll say goodbye. So there's a multitude of sections in the bill, but I just want to really explain kind of the three big pieces. The first is Section 2. That's the bad boy. That's the one that says it ain't going to happen no more. States, localities, you're not going to discriminate. In the original language, it was the intent that had to be proven. You had to intend they were discriminating, but they changed that a few decades ago to being result-orientated. So if you're doing something, whether it's putting a polling place in the middle of nowhere, or you're gerrymandering your district, you're drawing the congressional lines to make sure that the African Americans are split up or all grouped together to minimize the representation, or you're doing these literacy tests and you're doing them in unfair ways with poll taxes or whatever it might be, that's not going to happen anymore. We're going to shut that down. That's Section 2, and that applies to all localities across this country to this day. So if you can prove something that the result of it has this discriminatory effect on voting, then you're not going to be able to do that. But then there comes kind of like the extra mustard. Extra mustard, I don't know what that means, but in Section 5, I'm going to skip to Section 5, it says, there's some of you states out there that need a little bit of an extra kind of, magnifying glass, and you know who I'm talking about. We're talking about these states that have discriminated in the past, and that's what Section 4 is for. Section 4 is for the formula that basically says if you meet these formula conditions, then we're going to have some extra oversight. So one of them was if you had any discriminatory laws already on the book you were enforcing in 64, you're going to go to Section 5. And then the other one was if a certain amount of your voters weren't registered or weren't participating, you're going to get this extra oversight. And one of those pieces of oversight is called pre-clearance, which means we don't trust you so much. So before you pass any state laws that are going to maybe have a voter ID bill, or you're going to try to pass a new kind of literacy test, or whatever it might be, you're going to have to go to a district court, or you're going to have to go to the Attorney General first. And then the federal government will pat you on the head and say, good boy, good girl, you can do that, or it ain't going to happen, Sam. So that's a huge, humongous piece. Not to mention they're going to be able to put federal observers into these districts to make sure we're keeping even a closer eye on them. And there's a couple other parts. They were later updated to include making sure that we have bilingual ballots for people if they reach a certain percentage of the voting population, for the blind, yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, it's all about discrimination and making sure that the federal government's doing its job to enforce the 15th Amendment so states and localities aren't discriminating against their citizens. So isn't that dandy? Now I'm going to tell you why the bill is dead. So when the bill was renewed, it was renewed a few times in the 70s, Congress would write a new formula to kind of keep itself updated. But that didn't happen in 2006. The Voting Rights Act was renewed, but they didn't do anything in terms of the formula in Section 4. So what happened was in 2013, we have Shelby County versus Holder, which is a majority white district, I think Alabama, where they basically said, we don't want to have to go for permission anymore. We don't think that's constitutional. I mean, you have to remember, in the original U.S. Constitution, states are given the ability to come up with their own rules for how they want to run elections. Of course, the 15th Amendment steps on that. But Shelby County is saying, we don't think this is fair anymore. And in a 5-4 decision, the court says, you're right, that Section 4 is outdated, that because Congress didn't update it, it just doesn't apply anymore. So while Section 5 is good, we should still be able to do this to bad states, pre-clearance and make sure we're having observers there and such. But we're going to knock down Section 4. So without Section 4, there ain't no Section 5, baby. That's why the Voting Rights Act, as of now, is really a dead law. So guys, what do you think? Do you think that the Voting Rights Act is still needed, or was the Supreme Court right to say that was a long time ago, we should just all move on? Leave your comments below. We always love when you do that. And if you haven't subscribed to Hip Hughes History, I don't even want to look at you anymore.
That was a slightly different approach to presenting information about our democracy and voting rights. And we're going to go now live with yet a third approach with a presenter coming to us from Linz in Austria, who's going to take us up to the present. Bruce Miller, the floor is yours.
Okay, and do I have the ability to put up my, okay, let's see. Well, all right, you may have to help me here to get the Bill Sherm Fry game. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Good. So both of those two videos gave a really good overview of the problem that we're facing now. And the fast talking second one really gave a lot of details about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, also the VRA for short, and the Shelby County decision, which was a huge decision, as he mentioned. Because it removed the single most important enforcement mechanism of the VRA. But the Supreme Court didn't leave it at that. In a 2021 decision just last year, it lowered the previous legal hurdle that state voting laws had to clear in order not to be considered racially discriminatory. And that set the stage even more for what we've been calling a fight on four fronts for voting rights, which Betsy ran through at the beginning. So, it does work. So these are the four fronts again. And just this month, on February 7th, 3 weeks ago, the Supreme Court let an Alabama redistricting plan remain in effect that a federal district court panel of 3 judges, including 2 Trump appointees, had decided in this like 250-page decision was clearly in violation of the VRA's ban on racially discriminatory gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court just removed the stay and didn't even bother to rule on the merits of the case. And so their action was a strong signal to other states that they may be willing to discard that part of the VRA as well, which is not good. And that brings us to our historical overview here on the last day of Black History Month. And this also features courts acting badly in support of racial discrimination. And I would say, to me, it's a little eerie to think about the historical echoes that we're seeing in today's voting rights fights, because, again, as the second video mentioned, the Supreme Court has been a problem for voting rights and racial equality at times, and 2013 was not the first time. So, in slide 3 here, we're going all the way back to pre-Civil War to the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which was a ruling by a radicalized Supreme Court that had terrible effects. It involved a Black couple, Dred and Harriet Scott, who were slaves who had been taken by their master, their owner, into a free state. And they argued, since they had lived in a free state where slavery was illegal, that they should now be considered free. And as we see in the slide, the majority decision written by Chief Justice Roger Taney rejected their petition and went on to say that under the constitutional system, that Black men and women had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So that not only meant that free African Americans had no constitutional right to vote, but more immediately and catastrophically, it meant that free states could no longer ban slavery within their borders. And that destroyed, in effect, or set the stage for a very quick destruction of the balance between slave and free states, And that eliminated the possibility of even compensated emancipation schemes, which had been used in northeastern states earlier. So here is a picture of the Scots. This decision also overruled the states' rights of free states that Brigitte mentioned just a few minutes ago in a very dramatic way. The slave states only rediscovered the allegedly sacred principle of states' rights when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. And it is still a slogan used to justify the suppression of Black and Latino voters to this day. So this slide gets us to the Reconstruction period in the late 19th century. It's a reminder of two problems of the post-Civil War era, voter suppression and election subversion, that still frame our current forefront challenges to voting rights today. The three Civil War amendments, the 13, 14, and 15, and the 15th was mentioned in the second video, they secured the equal rights of all citizens, including formerly enslaved African Americans. Of course, women didn't have the right to vote in the Constitution until 1920. But the Reconstruction period was a time of really historic reform because there were a lot of Black voters participating wildly in the former, widely in the elections in the former Confederate states, and Black candidates were being elected to office. In fact, Jefferson Davis's former Senate seat in Mississippi was filled by a Black senator, the first Black senator in the United States. The conventional date that historians use for Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877, and that latter date refers to the Compromise of 1877, where there was a deal that allowed the Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes to become president, and both parties agreed to end the formal military occupation of the former Confederate states. This set the stage for mass disenfranchisement of African American voters through voter suppression and election subversion, and for the Jim Crow segregation system. So that second video we saw, and also Carol Anderson's book, describes some of the specific tactics used, like literacy tests and poll taxes. Some of those tactics we see today are different, but then some are the same. The project is fundamentally the same, though, as in post-Reconstruction period, which is to disenfranchise African American and Latino voters and any poor whites who might also be affected by the anti-voting measures. But there are two things that are critical about the post-Reconstruction period for us today. One is that even if we take 1890 as the end of that period, which some historians would, it means that voters, particularly Black voters, were effectively suppressed and elections stolen in the former Confederacy from 1890 until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's 75 years. The other thing is that none of these practices, which unfortunately were very effective in suppressing votes and stealing elections, none of them involved explicitly depriving Black citizens of the legal right to vote. It was achieved by setting up obstacle after obstacle after obstacle to voting. Which brings us to today and the past history hanging over it. On our first front, the January 6th insurrection of last year, it's important to remember that was a major attempt at election subversion. It was about reversing, it was about taking away the right of people to elect the president. And the perpetrators in that insurrection who committed criminal acts need to be prosecuted, and congressional investigations need to be thorough, which so far they seem to be. And also there's a legacy of impunity for crimes of high office holders that goes from Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee to Richard Nixon and so far to Donald Trump that really, really needs to end. So the second front, federal voting rights laws. I list out the ones here that have been under consideration, and we really need federal voting rights legislation to restore really the successful voting rights protections that govern U.S. elections from 1965 to 2013, and partially even up to today, but the Supreme Court is still trying to dismantle more of them. And in addition, the congressional procedures for counting electoral college votes for the presidency do need to be codified in a reform to the Electoral Count Act, which you may have heard about in the recent weeks because it's been talked about. But it's important to be aware that even if that reform is a very good one, it absolutely does not provide an adequate substitute for the voting rights legislation that unfortunately was blocked by the filibuster in the Senate in January. So and this slide deals with the current status of those bills, which could only be passed in 2022 if 2 more senators agree to change the filibuster rules. I won't mention any names here. And an Electoral Count Reform Act is still being discussed, but given the experience of the last 13 months, it's very doubtful that the Republicans are negotiating in good faith on that one. So it's important to understand that these legislative fixes are still urgently needed, and I hope something happens in 2022 that could be passed, because they're needed whether we're talking about 2022 or years from now. Hopefully it won't be as many years as we saw during the post-Reconstruction period. So the next slides show some of the kind of voter suppression measures that can be used and are being attempted now. And this slide shows, it's a tweet that the Texas GOP sent out showing that they, bragging about their intent to create longer lines at the polling places. So, and this is an approach. If you restrict early voting and restrict vote by mail and limit the number of polling places and limit the voting hours, you can create long lines and exclude the targeted voters. And of course, there are ways to target this to heavily African American and Latino districts, which Republicans do in these cases. Now, another tactic is literally erasing voters from the rolls, which is a popular Republican tactic. And I think Betsy mentioned this one was being done all the way back even in the early 2000s. Another idea is voter IDs can be used to create yet another hurdle to voting, even though in itself it may sound kind of harmless. And there's plain old physical intimidation, which can be used and has been used in the past, as we see here in this photo that was probably from the 1950s. But this set of practices is the post-Reconstruction method, and it's been tried and implemented, unfortunately, for decades before. You design a set of obstacles that prevent target groups from voting or discourage them from voting, and you make one obstacle after another. And when it comes to election subversion, that's something that can range from the high-level attempt we saw on January 6th to just old-fashioned stuffing the ballot box, which would today would require tampering with voting machines. But there's also in-between methods designed to put the vote counting in the hands of partisan Republicans that somebody mentioned just a few minutes ago. Then this is the third front that Sue discussed earlier. It consists of the legal and political fights against voter suppression and election subversion efforts. And here is another list of cases that have been in contention recently. And this is only a set of 4 states here, and there have been many states where this is going on. This is a nationwide fight, and including in places like Ohio and New York. So, and the fourth front is getting out the vote in 2022, which is an area that Democrats abroad can have a particular contribution to make. And Meredith was stressing this here in our meeting today. The voter suppression efforts this year make getting out the vote particularly urgent. We should not assume or let our elected officials assume, though, that get out the vote efforts would make federal voting rights legislation unnecessary. New voting rights laws are very necessary because we know that voter suppression and election subversion can be and have been effective. But the Democrats do have some advantages this year, not least of which is that Democratic positions are just plain more popular than Republican positions. And the Republicans are defending more Senate seats than the Democrats in 2022. And for an added incentive for the Democrats to hold on to a House majority, even though it's pretty thin right now, is an idea that some Republicans have floated, which is making Donald Trump Speaker of the House. And bizarre as that seems, they could do it. The Speaker of the House does not have to be a member of the House itself. And so I'll close this presentation on that cheerful thought. And Jazz is here, right? Okay, good. So I want to introduce Jazz now. He is the leader of the Democrats Abroad Black Caucus, which is a co-sponsor of this event. They have just completed a series of Black History Months events, and we're honored to have the caucus leader speaking to us today. So, Jazz, it's all yours.
We can't hear you. We cannot hear you.
Now?
Great. Hi,
Jazz,
we hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bruce, very, very much for your very warm introduction. And I will be hijacking this event for just 1 single minute, so please forgive me. Because before I start off, I would like to take a moment in unity and togetherness and pray or meditate for all of the victims who are losing their families, their homes, their futures, their lives. Please join me for 1 minute of silence of prayer and meditation. Thank you very, very much for all of your thoughts and prayers. And again, thank you very much for having us today. And first and foremost, my deepest gratitude goes out to all who contributed in advocating for Black History Month 2022 through hosting events, screenings, readings, webinars, and there was so much that we were able to see throughout the whole Democrats Abroad globe. Each and every shared fact or personal story nurtured the pool of wisdom and educated simply by sharing the knowledge of African-American history and history in the making. Black History Month is not just in February, it is every week, every day, and every second of the year, and is embedded in every fiber of our lives. And so are our voting rights. It is getting harder to vote. Nearly 40 years after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the landmark legislation prohibiting discrimination that blocked Black voters from the ballot box, states are increasingly passing restrictive voting laws that in some instances disproportionately affect people of color. If Black History Month is a moment to recognize how far we've come, it's also an opportunity to acknowledge how far we still have to go. This month, Republican lawmakers tweeted inspirational quotes in honor of Black civil rights icons, but banned literature and resources that tell the stories of our history. And leaders from all ends of the political spectrum will issue statements and engage in acts of solidarity while failing to use their power to dismantle the systems that continue oppressing Black people. We don't need your words of symbolic camaraderie. We need action. One of the most pivotal pieces of legislation to come from the civil rights movement was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was presented very perfectly here through Bruce. Facing violence and suppression at the hands of the state, Black voters marched from Selma to Montgomery, asking to be heard. Later that year, the Voting Rights Act passed, empowering Black voters by eliminating the racist hurdles that states had put in place to disenfranchise them. Since then, it's been gutted by the Supreme Court, and corrupt and racist lawmakers have enacted voter suppression bills all across the country. So here we are, almost 60 years since its passing, imploring our leaders to pass voting rights legislations once again. Congressional Democrats have attempted to do so, but Senate Republicans, unsurprisingly, have blocked it by using the notoriously racist American relic, the filibuster. This is why progressives have been vocal about the need for the Democratic Party to eliminate this procedure that throughout history has blocked anti-lynching legislation, anti-poll tax legislation, a national popular vote amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1966, and various other pro-civil rights legislation. The midterm elections are fast approaching, and nothing has been done to protect or expand the franchise. In a true democracy, your vote is your voice. So the continued dismantling of voting rights, a process that is designed to negatively impact Black voters, is stripping us of our voices. When it was recently announced that Maya Angelou would become the first Black woman to be featured on the Quarter, I couldn't help but think of the many ways lawmakers could truly honor the lives and legacies of Black women, past and present. One significant move would be to cancel student loan debt, which Black women hold more of an average than any other group. Student loan debt is an additional barrier that is working to maintain the racial wealth gap as a result of slavery, segregation, and the systemic racism that has shaped the US and the institutions. Black students are less likely to be beneficiaries of generational wealth. So it's no surprise that Black students borrow more via student loans. According to a 2019 report, the Brandeis University's Institute of Assets and Social Policy, 20 years after starting college, the median debt of white student borrowers has been reduced by 94%, with almost half holding no student debt, whereas Black borrowers at the median still owe 95% of their cumulative borrowing total. Additionally, NPR reported that about 80% of Black millennials with at least a bachelor's degree still have student loan debt, compared to only half of white millennials. The student debt crisis is a racial economic issue, and we must finally begin to address such. Representative Ayanna Pressley has said, broad-based student debt cancellation is precisely the kind of bold, high-impact policy that the broad and diverse coalition that elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris expect them to deliver. The Congressional Black Caucus has been pushing the Biden administration to cancel at least $50,000 in student debt per borrower, and while on the campaign trail, Biden committed to canceling $10,000 per borrower. None of this has happened, and for the record, $10,000 is not enough, especially for descendants of enslaved Black people who have never received the reparations that are owned by them. Representation is important, but it's not enough. Honoring our history is important, but it's not enough. In the wake of the 2020 global uprisings for Black lives, what tangible changes have we seen? Well, beyond the inaction on securing our voting rights and on taking steps that can financially empower generations of Black people who are being incarcerated at disproportionate rates by a justice system that is shaped by racism. Black Lives Matter protesters are still facing felony charges from their involvement in the protests. We are still being killed for simply existing. In February, 22-year-old Amir Lok was killed after Minneapolis police entered an apartment without knocking. Legislation could have reduced the likelihood of Lok's death, yet in the aftermath, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey is only temporarily banning no-knock warrants in certain situations. Our country is representing the parts of US history that we should have learned from, the parts of our leaders claim to be so far removed from, especially when February ends. This month, our lawmakers will praise the strength and impact of our Black history makers while disregarding the fact that they are walking among the Black history makers of tomorrow. These legislators are the leaders who will be in future history books. As a people who held up progress, as the leaders who refused to create a better nation for Black people and for everyone else too. So when we talk about Black history, we're not just talking about the past, we're talking about the history being made in the present as well as what's to come. Because Black history is living, breathing. Who and where we were yesterday directly impacts who we are today. And who we are today is a direct reflection of who we will be tomorrow. During our last election, Black voters came out in record numbers and delivered by putting Democrats in power. This is the time for change. If Democrats aren't going to take tangible action, nothing will change. So we'll keep reliving the same sad history. And come next election, Black voters might not choose to save our democracy. To truly honor and uplift this month, which is ending today, you have to honor and uplift the people, the Black people. We are the descendants of the Black history makers who risked their lives for the soul of this country. To look us in the eyes and claim to honor our history while dismissing our present is insulting, irresponsible, and in line with many embarrassing contradictions that plague our country's history. And during our 2022 advocacy statement, recognizing and celebrating small victories for the big win this statement is guiding us through a very, very intense midterm election year. And one of these small but very significant victories is simply the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to become the 116th Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. This time has come for a qualified, experienced Black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. Promise made, promise kept. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you everybody joining this great call, which has been hosted by the Progressive Caucus.
Wow, thanks, Jazz. So we're coming up on very close to the end of our time together. I'd like to open it up very quickly for comments. I know, are there folks who have to leave right away who might want to speak first? I see Arnie has a hand up, and we'll just, it'll be very brief because we have a bunch of action items we want to share. So Arnie, could you be super concise?
Yeah, I wasn't talking about legislation. I was talking about what the president can do, like education debt. It's in his power to take care of that. There's a lot of other issues. He's done some good things, certainly better than Republicans, but nobody's impressed because there's so much more. And also he's done some bad things, like privatizing healthcare to some extent. So I'm talking about that the vice president should become president and that there should be a lot of support for her to do a lot of things so that people can see that the Democrats are serious about making life better.
Thanks,
That's
Arnie.
what I'm saying.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, there's a difference between the executive orders and legislation.
The vice president in waiting.
Okay, thanks. So so our team putting together the event today has some actions to share for moving ahead. And I think Betsy, we're going to start with you, and you might see some things in the chat as well.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay, so great. So what we can do in DA is get active in GOTV in a country or even in your state team committee. And DA has developed many state teams focused on GOTV. So you could join the state teams. This is the Slack link to find out what states are planning and find out how to get involved. And if you have any questions, please write to states@democratsabroad.org. Also, train yourself for DA phone banking and voter registration. I have to just, little aside, I've done it and it's great fun to do it. And here's the link here, new voter registration training at Democrats Abroad. Also, you can write to your congressperson and ask them to continue to support voting rights legislation. Tell them why this is important for American democracy. And what you can say is, I am who you are and a member of Democrats Abroad. I live in this country and vote in this state. I urge you to support voting rights legislation. And what you could do to find your representative in the House is just click on the link. Encourage support for the Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act, which Bruce Lee talked about. Also, there's a link here about it, the ACLU, very interesting information here. Consider to support the Electoral Count Act reform. Here's a link here which explains it in detail. And also, see also Public Citizen, and here's the link here. And these folks are very visibly protecting democracy on the voting rights level. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to David Mivaser. I'm not sure if I have your name, said your name correctly, David, but you're going to give us also some more ideas.
That's right. Thank you very much. I just put in the chat 2 ideas. One of them is a group I've been active with since the last presidential election called VoPros, and that stands for Voter Protection Professionals. The word professional is a little bit of a joke because we're all volunteers, but we try to do it on a really professional level. And what we do is we work with groups on the ground in critical swing states, doing very pragmatic, fine-grained work around gathering data that's needed for groups on the grounds to protect voter protection, and also making phone calls and contacts. So just for example, I was involved in a project the last few weeks going through all 67 counties in Pennsylvania, all more than 9,000 precincts in the entire state, and getting all the data about elected voter officials, like voting judges, election inspectors, the constables, so that the people on the ground in Pennsylvania in the Democratic Party's efforts can see where there are gaps and where the Democratic Party doesn't have anyone, hasn't shown up, so we can get people to be there. I'm just giving that as an example of something that's very pragmatic, very immediate, and very effective that we can do from anywhere in the world. And we need to do this right now. So any of us can sign up with VoPros. We're active in several swing states. If you go to the link that I posted into the chat, you'll see what we're doing, and you'll have links that you can use to join any of it. And if you are interested, you can just contact me and talk with me about it. I'll help you figure out, like, really, what is it, and do you want to be involved? The other thing I want to talk about is, beside our Democrats Abroad state teams, every state has a Democratic Party that's thoroughly engaged on the ground in their state. And we can get involved in those swing states that are going to make a difference in the US Senate and in the Congress. So just for example, I vote in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has an open seat in the US Senate. We're going to elect either a Democrat or a Republican. Pennsylvania is a swing state that Trump unfortunately won by a tiny handful of votes, way less than 1% in 2016. And then Biden won by a very small margin in 2020. So I feel like it's very important to be involved in Pennsylvania. There are other states like that. So I signed up with the Democratic Party of Pennsylvania. and there's active text banking going on. That, for example, I did it on Saturday. I'm going to do it on Tuesday. I can spend 2 or 3 hours right here in my place abroad texting thousands of voters and getting them to request their absentee ballots, write-in ballots, renew their registration, all these things that we need to do. So I'm just giving some information about how to get involved very pragmatically, very immediately. And that's in the chat. And again, if you have any questions, just feel free, find me, look me up, talk with me, and I'll be happy to, answer any questions you have. So thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Evelyn, did you have something quickly? And then Bruce is going to do our closing
Yes,
remarks.
I mean, we're Democrats abroad. Democrats abroad also has phone banking, state teams, and so on. We have 93.2% who do not vote, overseas voters who do not vote. And it really would be a challenge, and it would be urgent to try to find those people. We can work on both sides of the ocean and cooperate with each other to find these people. In Georgia and Arizona, as I mentioned in our kickoff event on the 21st, John Lewis's birthday, we made the difference. We won, we got Biden to win the state because of the overseas votes. In Georgia, the overseas votes exceeded Biden's margin of victory. And we have to stop focusing on only the states. We really have to look at the overseas voters and find them. This is an enormous resource. And in the states, we also have the problem that people are also non-voters. And I personally think it's not the Trumpites that are causing the problem and voting the wrong people in. It's also the people sitting at home not voting on everywhere on the planet.
Yeah.
And we really have to think about this and focus on this, and how do we find these people? How do we engage them? How do we mobilize this? Because we live in a time where there are razor thin margins. I mean, that's basically what David just said, a few hundred votes, a few this. Some small elections, there are sometimes one vote or 18 votes. Okay, fine.
So true. Evelyn, I was just going to ask, could you drop the phone bank training link into the chat? We always encourage phone banking for Democrats abroad when we're having our meetings and getting to our action calls.
Right
oh, okay. Well, someone will drop it in. Okay. I think we have it ready to go anyway. And I think at this point, Bruce Murray is going to share some additional action announcements for us. Thanks, everybody.
I'd like to thank all of our presenters and all of you who commented. I want to give a special thanks to Jazz for their comments. They really inspired me, and I agree completely that we have to get out the vote. And one of the ways we can get out the vote is by giving people a reason to get out and vote. And among them are making sure that we deliver on what the people need. So we have our work cut out for us. Fortunately, others are working with us. I encourage everyone to vote, volunteer for these leaders in our forefront fight. Remember, Jennifer Lawrence is spokesperson for Represent Us. There's the link, and I think it'll go into the chat box too. Also down there in Georgia, remember Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor, started Fair Fight. It is active in many states in the United States, and it deserves our help also. Also, the younger voters are being contacted, especially by Next Gen America, started by Tom Steyer. They're active all over the United States too. They're working for us, and we ought to be working with them. Then follow the work of our DA voter protection team. Their email is here. They're grouping now for 2022. And there also is a very active voter protection team in Democrats Abroad United Kingdom. You can contact them by going to that link, and getting the email off to them. And last but not least, join our proDA Progress for Progressives meeting this Saturday, March 5th at 2 p.m. Central European Time. Why? To discuss what we can do to win this and the many other fights we are waging to complete our unfinished business. You can RSVP, and if you join us on Saturday, you'll hear a great opening message from Fleetwood Mac. I want to thank all of you again. We're going to stop our recording at this point. And if you'd like to stick around for some informal chat for 10 minutes or so, that would be great.